Hey, everybody, welcome to Red May, your 1 month vacation from capitalism. 44 events, 110 speakers, lots of killer stuff. Let me clue you into some of the things that are coming up today, after today, but before we get into today's events. On Wednesday at 11 a.m., there is no unhappy revolution. Great title, with Idris Robinson and Alessandro Renzi. At 5 p.m. on Wednesday, we have Marx Asia History with Rebecca Carl, Gavin Walker, Ken Kawashima, and Assad Haider. At Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we have Critical Theory in the 21st Century with Amy Diath, Chris O'Kane, Werner Bonefeld, and Christian Lutz. And at 5 p.m. on Thursday, we have Counterinsurgency Policing with Amadeo Chieng, Paul Passavant, Stuart Schrader, Tavis Harris, Paige May, Samantha Prey-Gonzalez, and Charmaine Schwaz, moderator. On Friday, the 28th at 11 a.m., Debt After Graeber, Collection and Repossession. Max Haven, Cassie Thornton, Radhika Desai, Lee Claire LaBerge, and Andrew Ross. At Friday at 3 p.m., we have What Just Happened with Joshua Clover, Jody Dean, Theoria Francos, Idris Robinson, Nikhil Pal Singh. It's kind of our news show reviewing the last year. On Sunday at 10 a.m., sorry, let me revise that, Saturday, May 29th at 10 a.m., Neither Settler Nor Native with Mahmoud Mandani, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Samara Esmail, and Ted Swedenberg. And at 11 a.m. on Sunday, Rethinking the Chinese Cultural Revolution with Alessandro Russo, Andrea Piazzaroli Longobardi, Chris Connery, and Assad Haider. And then at 5 p.m. that night, Feminist International, How to Change Everything with Veronica Gago, Michael Hart, and Kathy Weeks. On Monday, May 31st at 11 a.m., Marx for Cats, a radical bestiary with Lee Claire LaBerge. And at 6 p.m. on Monday, Theory of the Gimmick, Aesthetic Judgment and Capitalist Form with Sia Nagai and Christopher Neelan. So lots of stuff coming up. How do we do it? We do it without institutional support, but with your generosity. And we want to do this again next year, so we're collecting money now. Go to our website, www.redmayseattle.org, and give generously. You can give to our GoFundMe, Fan the Flames of Red May, or you can become a patron at $3, $5, $10, and $20 per month. All right, enough craven appeals for money. I want to get right into the main event on value, communism, and what is Jasper? What is the title? It's value, communism, and capitalism, or value, capitalism.
I believe it's value, capitalism, and communism.
Value, capitalism, and communism. All right, the key word is value here. We're lucky, as always, to have Jasper Bernes, who I think has been part of almost every Red May. He's the author of the scholarly book, The Work of Art in the Age of Industrialization, Deindustrialization, and 2 books of poetry, Stars Down and We Are Nothing and So Can You. And he's currently completing The Communist Prospect About Revolution in the 21st Century for Verso. Responding to Jasper's vision of value, capitalism, and communism are Cordelia Belton, who is an avocational theorist and professional revolutionary. In the former capacity, she's completing a book on the grounding of Marx's imminent critique, the critique of vulgar political economy and the logic of communism. We also have Kailash Srinivasan, a PhD candidate in political science at Ohio State University, Many of you know him as the caretaker of the great Facebook Value Forum board, which is one of the centers of conversation about the Neue Marx Lektur. And also, of course, he's working on legal theory, Evgeny Pashukanis. So, Jasper, I will turn it over to you and we'll settle into my listening chair. And I look forward to hear what you have to say about value.
Great. Thank you, Philip, for the introduction, and thanks to Red May for hosting this, and to everyone who's watching for coming. So I wrote a long essay, a long and many layered essay, the main points of which I have attempted to condense so that I can present them to you today. And then we'll hear from some people whose thought was inspiring to me during the writing of this essay. And this essay is available online. What is capitalism? What is communism? These are centrally important questions for communists. They were also centrally important to Marxist critique of political economy and to the concept of value as Marx developed it. The purpose of the concept of value is to answer both questions simultaneously. The value of value, in other words, is to define capitalism in such a way that one also discloses the necessary predicates of communism. The most important thing we can observe at first about the two terms is that they are contradictory. I don't mean this in a loose sense. They are logically contradictory in the following way, which we might reformulate as the axiom of contradiction: not both capitalism and communism. There can be capitalism, there can be communism, but there cannot be both capitalism and communism. The relationship is one of non-conjunction, not and, rather than simple disjunction, either or. Capitalism and communism are therefore something more than simply opposed. They can't both be true at the same time. Marx's first forays into the critique of political economy were attempts to probe the boundaries of capitalism and communism as concepts. That's one way to understand the meaning of the abstruse term value. Value is a critical heuristic, meant not only to define the inner consistency of capital, but also to illuminate it in the refracted glare of communism. What do I mean by this? In the Grundrisse in particular, and in Contribution to Critique of Political Economy, where he first starts looking into these questions, he first hit on the concept of value in a critical examination of the concept of labor money. Labor money derived from the labor theory of value of Ricardo in a strange way. The labor theory of value licensed the concept of surplus value, that all wealth was a product of labor and therefore all profit exploitation, but also warranted the anti-capitalist idea that goods might be correctly priced in terms of labor time, therefore returning to each worker the fruits of their labor. Marx hits on his concept of value, his critique of the labor theory of value, by demonstrating that this is impossible. In a capitalist economy, if you price all goods in terms of labor time, market forces will inevitably introduce a gap between the stated and real value of the good. The only way to eliminate this gap is to balance supply and demand and ensure uniform productivity. In other words, to plan in advance the whole of production, in which case a reform of money is irrelevant. In this sense, value is a kind of test, a way of illuminating not only what makes capitalism capitalism, but in doing so also illuminating what communism is. Though the term test is mine, I come to this way of thinking about value as a kind of test from Amadeo Bordiga by way of Gilles Dauvé. The problem is that there are issues with the way they set up their test. I've been worrying over these terms, value, communism, capitalism, and their relationship since around 2012. Then I was reading Gilles Dauvé's ultra-left critique of the ultra-left, in which value features prominently. And I was reading I.I. Rubin's essays on Marxist theory of value. And I was reading the best theorization on the USSR I could find. And I noticed a discrepancy. Both Dauvé and Bordiga, for example, say that value was operative in the USSR when, as I understood Marxist theory and the available facts, it could not be. Bordiga and Dauvé confused the test of value, you might say, with a test of communism, which would include the test of value. For example, Bordiga takes the continuing presence of wages and money in the USSR as evidence of value, when in fact, money could not function as capital there, nor wages as wages. Value might be abolished, and yet traces of class society persist, such that what we have is neither capitalism nor communism. Capitalism and communism are not the only options. There is something that is neither capitalism nor communism. This seems obvious, but it's important to state it. To the axiom of contradiction, we must add the common ruin corollary. There can be capitalism, there can be communism, but there cannot be both capitalism and communism. There can be, however, neither capitalism nor communism. The relationship between capitalism and communism is non-conjunction, not and, rather than simple disjunction. If you treat it as either or, you forget other modes of production exist beyond capitalism and communism. To be specific, not both capitalism and communism means either not capitalism or not communism. Either capitalism will be suppressed or communism will. More than that, we cannot say. What the non-conjunction of capitalism and communism implies is a choice of negations, not a choice of positives. At stake here are very real questions about the definition of communism. For example, Dauvé implies that the society outlined in Marx's brief note on the lower stage of communism in the critique of the Gotha program would not, as Marx argues, eliminate the law of value, and would therefore not have fully abolished capitalism. At issue here is Marx's claim that in the lower stage of communism, communism as it emerges, not as it develops, distribution of the consumer product to workers will have to be equalized through the use of what he calls a labor certificate. The first thing to note, however, and where many commentators get confused, is that this labor certificate is in fact quite different from the labor money Marx critiqued much earlier on when he developed his theory of value. Within the cooperative society based on common ownership of the means of production, Marx writes, the producers do not exchange their products. Just as little does the labor employed on the products appear here as the value of these products, as a material quality possessed by them. Since now, in contrast to capitalist society, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. I want to highlight the phrase, the producers do not exchange their products. Many readers miss this, but it's essential to understanding Marx's vision of communism. What he means is that the distribution of resources to producers, to workshops or work units or whatever you want to call them, takes place directly. Because this is communism, Marx assumes that by definition, a clothing maker would not purchase fabric, but receive it directly from the textile works or wherever, according to common plan. And this is why value is not operative. Value is not just a concept, an accounting technique, but a property of commodities, as Marx says. In capitalism, value appears as a law, as an impersonal regulator of production, determining the exchange of products between producers, each of them forced to produce at a given cost or be undersold. Here, in the scheme, none of that can happen because, as Marx says, the producers do not exchange their products. The certificate is used only to portion consumption. To be more specific about what value is and isn't, and what capital is and isn't, in capitalism, distribution of labor and capital between enterprises is regulated through production for profit. Because of the law of one price, because goods sell at a single price, firms and workers must produce at a given cost or be bankrupted. Firms must economize on costs and must make sure workers labor at a given level of intensity. In the scenario Marx describes, no such pressures would exist. In fact, issuing certificates tells you little about how to organize production, how many shirts to produce, how many tomatoes to grow, and what kinds of workers are needed where. All of that would have to be determined according to plan, because that is a matter of organization of production beforehand, not organization of distribution after. There is nothing in Marx's scenario that would compel one producer to change its techniques or outputs except direct decision. In capitalism, the law of value, by forcing each producer to attempt to undersell the other by economizing on labor, introduces a pattern of accumulation, a tendency toward growth and constant technical change. The law of value, in this sense, tells you the laws of motion of capitalism. But in Marx's scenario, there are no such laws. Labor time is measured through the certificate, but it regulates only consumption, not production. This means that it can't really force any kind of norms for output. I probably need to be specific about another aspect of the labor certificate and its difference from the labor money he critiques in the earlier text. The way it works for Marx is you receive a certificate for having worked a given length of time, the average workday. Let's say it's 4 hours because this is communism. And in exchange for this certificate, you receive from the social stores wealth it took on average that amount of time to produce. It doesn't matter how productive one is or how productive one's workshop is, you still receive the same amount. This is important to note because set up like this, the labor certificate can't function as a labor norm, as the wage does in capitalism. It can't force you to work at a certain level or achieve a certain output. Only the threat of dismissal or differential wages could do that, both of which are impossible in this scenario. You can't dismiss someone if labor is both an obligation and a guarantee, except inasmuch as they go work somewhere else and become someone else's problem. If you want to establish an output norm, this will have to be done by common plan, not through the certificate. Marx is fully aware of these limitations. The certificate is not a way to organize communist society, but a birth defect of its emergence from capitalism, he says. The notion of equal right upon which the certificate is based is bourgeois right, he admits, and still stigmatized by bourgeois limitation. The main purpose of the critique of the Gotha program is to critique the Gotha program. In other words, to argue against the Lassallean notion of a just distribution, that you could give back to the workers exactly the value that they've produced. Every equality, Marx tells us, is predicated on an inequality. The equality of the labor certificate enforces is in fact unequal, as he acknowledges. On the one hand, Marx says, one man is superior to another physically or mentally and supplies more labor in the same time or can labor for a longer time. On the other hand, one worker is married, another is not, one has more children than another, and so on and so forth. In order to recognize these different abilities and different needs, right, instead of being equal, he says, would have to be unequal, by which he means some may need to consume more, others may not be able to work or be able to work less. Communism, to be equal, would have to recognize these inequalities. The only equality is, in fact, inequality. The quite radical thing to note here is that communism for Marx is not about equality or fairness at all. What the worker contributes during their 4 hours is not equal to what they receive. They receive the same amount no matter how little or how much they actually produce. There is no attempt, as with labor money, to measure and compensate workers for their actual productivity, allowing workers to earn more or less, depending on how much they actually produce. From each according to his ability to each according to his needs is not a relationship of equality at all. There's not an equal sign that maps one side of that function to the other, but a relationship between different abilities and different needs that can never be made equal and need not be. In fact, the all-around development of the individual, the goal of communism for Marx, presumes different needs and abilities. Development is the key term for Marx, not equality. Communism, from the very beginning, will have to address those particular needs directly. Equality will require, in some cases, an unequal distribution of resources, particularly to areas that have, particular kinds of needs. And this is, of course, a matter of global redress. The labor certificate then doesn't help you to organize production. It doesn't establish norms or output targets or anything like that. So what then is its purpose? This is where I begin to think Dauvé has a point, even though he focuses not on the certificate itself, but on the fact that labor time is being measured. There are only two answers I can think of, and neither are particularly good. The first is that the certificate forces everyone to work. This is not mentioned directly in Marx, but made explicit in the attempts to outline the organization of production and distribution by labor certificate, such as the Group of International Communists, Fundamentals of Communist Production and Distribution. The second is that it's necessary if there's a scarcity of goods. So just taking the first argument for it, if the purpose is to make sure enough work takes place, then the certificate does a pretty poor job of it. This is because if labor is an obligation and guarantee, then there is no way to establish output norms. If everyone must work, then those who don't work will simply work poorly or maybe not at all. To make it function like a wage, you would need to be able to fire people, to threaten them with starvation and dispossession, to introduce incentives or differentials, all of which are obviously in contradiction with communism as defined, or at least likely to introduce destabilizing dynamics. As for scarcity, which certainly might exist, if there's a shortage of goods, then for obvious reasons that may mandate rationing based on need. However, the necessity of rationing is not an argument for rationing through the workplace. In fact, calculating labor time and distributing wealth through the workplace would be far more complicated than simply distributing directly to people where they consume. So that's not really an argument for it either. Neither the argument from compulsion nor the argument from scarcity justifies the labor certificate. And in fact, together they serve to demonstrate that it would be either extrinsic or actively harmful. If you've already organized production according to common plan, then you don't need it to compel labor. If you do need to compel labor, however, then you haven't organized according to common plan, and the certificate won't help you to do so. In fact, it might be actively harmful or give rise to destructive dynamics. The point of the critique of the Gotha program is not to argue for the labor certificate, though he certainly does, as much as it is to argue against the idea of the fair proceeds of labor or just distribution. There is no such thing. At the end of his whole discussion, he says, quite apart from the analysis so far given, it was in general a mistake to make a fuss about so-called distribution and put the principal stress on it. Any distribution whatever of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. Is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. The main task then is to redistribute the means of production, not just the means of consumption, so that the birth defects of capitalism are minimized, if not eliminated altogether. So I want to try to be clear about what that looks like in the little time left to me. One thing I get from Bordiga, from his idea that the whole of Marx's work is a vision of communism, and this is something that he doesn't exactly say, but the Dauvé says of him, is attention to those places in Marx's writing where, in order to illuminate what is intolerable about capitalism and what makes capitalism capitalism, he makes a comparison to a putative communism. They're quite common if you know where to look. He does this, in fact, at the culmination of the first chapter of Capital, in the discussion of the fetishism of commodities. You can't understand the fetishism of commodities without comparing capitalism to communism. Let us imagine, he says, for a change, an association of free men working with the means of production held in common and expending their many different forms of labor power in full self-awareness as one single social labor force. And this is meant to contrast with the condition in capitalism. And then he concludes at the end of this that the veil is not removed, as he says, from the countenance of the social life process, i.e. the process of material production, until it becomes production by freely associated men and stands under their conscious and planned control. And I think that this is a pretty good definition of what communism is for Marx, and a pretty good definition of communism in general, though I think it's missing a few things. Unlike capitalism, where relations are both mystified and beyond the control of individual producers, in communism, relations are direct and transparent, based on free association, organized around common purpose. Marx doesn't just compare capitalism and communism in this passage, though, since that would make the relationship either or rather than not and. He also compares capitalism and communism to class society that is neither capitalist nor communist, where domination is personal and direct and not affected through exchange of commodities, as in capitalism. Only in capitalism is production both mystified and unfree, but only in communism are relations transparent in their simplicity and freely organized. Communist activity must be transparent, unmystified, but also under the control of the freely associated producers. This is the test. Does the labor certificate pass? It's not clear that the relationship between concrete hours worked and the fraction of socially necessary labor time that workers consume is exactly transparent. Deductions need to be made for those who can't work, for any expansion of production, and for direct need that's not addressed by the certificate. The amount of this deduction will have to be made by decision, introducing another level of inequivalence. So you wouldn't actually get, if you worked 4 hours, you wouldn't exactly get 4 hours. You would get 4 hours minus whatever needs to be deducted for those who can't work and for whatever you consume collectively rather than individually. So it wouldn't, there isn't an actual equivalence, and that's sort of the point. Further, the certificate does not reveal anything about the underlying conditions of workplaces, how hard the workers labor, how productive their tools are. It might in fact naturalize and include these differences. As for control, we've already seen that the certificate does not help to organize production or reorganize production. So it's not really useful, but could it be harmful? Perhaps. The most obvious problem to me is that the certificate presumes not only the persistence of bourgeois right and law, this notion of abstract equality, which is problematic, but that it requires a social judgment about who can work and who can't. The certificate can't enforce a labor norm, but it does imply a normative concept of ability. But who decides who is able to work or not? It may be that people who don't want to work should be considered people who can't work. And I think that that's actually, might be a helpful way for, communism to think about the organization of work. But secondly, and this is implicit in Marx's discussion of differential need, the certificate implies a judgment about what counts as work and what doesn't. Unpaid, and I think you should pay attention to the moment where Marx talks about the workers with wives. Unpaid reproductive work can continue unremunerated. Thirdly, when you needlessly individualize consumption, you hinder the formation of collectivity and belonging, aggravating, egoizing, and individualizing motives. Rather than having workers consume individually, it would make more sense in most cases to immediately communize as much consumption as possible, collective storehouses, canteens, free transport, free medicine, free housing. Some will argue that the certificate allows for freedom, for choice, because people can exchange the tokens for any good in existence, allowing for unique needs to be met and the demand for rare items to be tracked. And certainly, diversity of need is part of Marx's conception of communism. But such unique needs can also be met directly through communal life in many cases. In any case, if certificates were in use for some small portion of needs, perhaps unique ones, and labor were not compelled, then the certificates would certainly not be problematic, since so much of life would already be organized according to common plan. Collective life would render consumption through individual transaction needless or maybe anachronistic in many cases. I've developed from Marx's writing and Bordiga and Dauvé tests of value and of communism that arrive at conclusions different than theirs. by way of a fidelity to what I think are their deepest insights. This is a sympathetic critique, a refinement. And what's important is what these tests reveal about capitalism and communism. Communism must abolish value, but the abolition of value is not an adequate definition of communism. Where social life is no longer subordinated to the law of value, it must be brought together under the common plan of freely associated individuals whose condition of acting together is a fundamental commonality of interest. This is the test. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, I want to thank Jasper so much for a wonderfully generative and insightful piece, and the really admirable job he did popularizing it. I know that I personally took away a lot of interesting concepts from the piece, which I've gone back and forth reading a few times since he first emailed it to me. In particular, I've come back to the test of value, what the test of value means, and then this other phrase, which I'm also going to hit on a little bit in this talk, which is value as the demon in the matrix, which is this wonderfully evocative presentation of what value is ontologically, epistemologically. The piece also raises what I think is a really interesting question. Jasper says in it, there's a missing moment, an absent positive to the inversion of value. Indeed, that missing moment is what is fundamentally missing from life, not just in capitalism, but in all class society. And Jasper also said in the talk, the value of value is to define capitalism in such a way that we know the necessary predicates of communism, if you'll allow the sloppy paraphrase. So what I'm going to try to do in this panel is to outline an approach to recovering that missing positive moment, why we are able to do this, and why it should matter for our conception of communism. And I'm going to try to do this with some light value theory and ultimately a little epistemology and metaethics. So I'm going to argue at the end for a particular kind of communist reason, which I think is totally contentious. Maybe you could say it borders on a communist welfarism. But to start, I'm going to talk about the piece. So there are two tests, communism and value. And I'm going to be focusing in on the test of value and then returning to the test of communism a little later. So in the piece, we see Marx's value theory offers a method by which certain socialist proposals can be put to the test. This is prediction, but only of a certain sort. It does not tell you what will happen or what must. The test of value is a logical test. It works from the definition of capitalism, its basic logical structure, in order to clarify what it would mean to overcome it. And Jasper brought up in the talk, we can certainly have non-capitalism, something that's both non-capitalism and non-communism. We can't have both capitalism and communism. So I see the test of value as something along the lines of, if some necessary moment, the logic of capital is present, we have a dynamic of implication such that the mutually necessary moment spins out into the presence of generalized commodity production. We also see value presented as the inner essence, one that the bourgeois are in no need of. I don't entirely agree with this characterization specifically, in large part because value, the penetration of economic appearances to discern value, is for me not really the particular insight in capital, insofar as, like in letter for Kugel, to Kugelmann, which is cited in Test of Communism, we see that Marx says science consists in demonstrating how the law of value asserts itself. The history of the theory certainly shows that the concept of the value relation has always been the same. So this is something that I found really interesting in Michael Heinrich's clear presentation, the political implications of form analysis. At a high level, we see in Capital, we go from, the question is not necessarily penetrating to find the true categories behind the false ones. For me, it's something a little more along the lines of, we have these real material social relationships between people. And so we're entertaining the question of why these social relationships necessarily appear to us in the economic categories they do. This is a little bit of a sidebar. So to return to the test of value, we have this test that essentially takes the form of something like, we have the presence of wage labor, or something like it, ergo we have generalized commodity production. And so this, for me, the question is, so what? So what this tells us to me is that this concept of, for example, wage labor, with which we apprehend society, implies this necessary concept that follows of generalized commodity production. I will say, though, in real political debates, like questions over the Soviet Union, although I think the concepts entertained in the piece are more or less on point, we often have these cases where the core of the debate boils down to the fact that the concept of, for instance, a commodity production or wage labor, with which someone is apprehending society, with which my interlocutor is apprehending things, taking in things, is different than my concept. If they had my concept of wage labor, or they had my concept of commodity production, they would agree that in this society, it would follow that there is value or that there is not value. But we're often looking at these things with totally different concepts. And it's sort of an interesting question, how we justify our use of a particular kind of abstraction versus someone else's. The second question is, all right, so we know that if we have wage labor, we have commodity production, we have generalized commodity production, we have value. I think an interesting big question is, so what? Why should we care? Capital Volume 1, famously, the most terrible missile hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie. Very provocative, very funny quote. We see a little in the test of communism, discussion of, this shows that generalized commodity production is impermanent. I don't think this is the substance of the big, so what? Why should we care? Why should we care about the test of value, or the existence of value, in other words? If I show a particular trait of a social formation, for instance, something like relatively contingent, like democracy, to be impermanent, which is self-evident, I would say. We see democracy wax and wane, we see continual liberal panics over fascism and so on. Showing that democracy is impermanent does not unto itself function as a critique of democracy. If I value democracy for some extrinsic reason, I'm very likely to say, well, the fact that this is impermanent entails that I should be involved in this project to buttress democracy against these threats. And I agree also that the so what for the test of value is not pure ideology critique. Ideology critique, whatever. There's totally something else there. So the question is, for me, so we have the test of value. Where's the so what? What is the ground for the critique? Why should we dislike, for example, crisis if we're interested in impermanence? Or why should we dislike value in general? Most folks, were I to say to them, society is governed by value, it's making you produce in ways which maximize value, we get a lot of liberal economic apologia for the invisible hand of the market and so on. It's really terrific. This social domination is actually really terrific at making people behave in ways that reflect the best way of handling certain trade-offs. a lot of there's the classic, there's the Austrian, classic Austrian like bread piece. There's a ton of stuff on this point because it really is remarkable. If you think this is fine, then you live in a charmed world where the best of all possible worlds, you're actually being compelled to act in a way that brings this about. So again, I think I'm intrigued by the concept that Marx is engaging in critique. I agree it's not ideology critique. I agree it has to do with the test of value, but I'm going to try to locate the so what. And I think that this will help us generate that missing positive moment. So for me, a concept of the good is implicated in all of these accounts of crisis, something like abstract social domination, what have you. I think this critique is arguably more key than purely logical verification. An argument for why domination, the deleterious effects of domination for value are ultimately inescapable, they cannot be remediated under capitalism, that would be a really tremendous argument. And for me, this is very interesting, something you can tease out of capital. And it isn't solely logical verification, wherein we say in some closed system of axioms, what have you, that if X is true, we have wage labor, then Y is true, we have such and such mode of production. So what kind of critique is this? And you see a lot of people refer to it in broad strokes as something like abstract social domination, which is a Postonian term. I think there are particular reasons why we can't just take this and be done. Domination is kind of a confused term with a long history between Republican, Petit, Hegelian usages, and so on. The core of the question is, what's wrong with value? Why can't we just return the true value of labor to workers? Of course, we agree. Doing this is not abolition of value, but redistribution and social democracy is a lot easier than communism. I think that this critique, a specific variant of this critique, can actually be found in Jasper's essay. And to find it, we go back to the passage of the missing moment within not just capitalist life, but all class society. There's some trans-historical missing moment that to me is kind of reminiscent of Marx's moral naturalism. It evokes to me something along the lines of Hegel's species concepts. And I'm going to explain later on a couple embeddings of this critique and a few normative groundings. But for the time being, I'm going to briefly touch on why this is different than any arbitrary moral critique. For instance, the moral critique that capitalism is bad because it's unfair, or that capitalism is, bad because for X and Y downstream reasons. Well, I think there are a couple unique properties of it. It isn't specific to any one kind of normative grounding. And in a way, that's because it's also, and this is to be tendentious, it is tendential, not necessarily tendential in the sense of the big picture historical tendencies that we see discussed so insightfully in the test of communism, but in the sense of emergent, not just at the level of formal verification. And I think you could probably formulate this with a kind of philosophical weak emergentism if you were so inclined. I'm not going to do this. What I mean by that is what we can pluck from this argument, this test is, given either X and Y assumptions about people, agents, what have you, who have preferences for X and Y things, or alternatively, if you're more Aristotelian than that, you can say people who are naturally a certain way and whose telos is naturally a certain way. In the aggregate, we get domination of agents in a way that precludes this. We are not able to actually realize either their preferences or their telos or what have you. The system prevents them from acting in a way in accordance. And this is totally unique. It's very interesting as far as concepts in philosophy go. And for me, there's a really cool point of disjunction between these sorts of concepts and, for instance, social kinds in analytic epistemology, the kinds of stuff we talk about in conceptual engineering as well, because it's almost like the concept is knowable prior to empirical apprehension. I'm not going to say that this is like quite like something like a synthetic a priori judgment, or you can't have these assumptions about people a priori. You can't have assumptions about markets or the objectification of social relations a priori, but it's still pretty cool. The categories, the economic forms that have these real forces that push people around are emergent from a pretty prosaic a set of assumptions about agents and markets and so on. Usually categories, and I'm going to pick a controversial example here that might upset the psychoanalysts in the audience. I would say usually categories, abstractions in general, can't push back when you disagree. If I have something like Freud's concept of the unconscious, or this, and I'm like, no, this is totally wrong, totally specious, I would propose that if I decide to act in a way that fails to confirm the particular presuppositions, predictions of this concept, it can't do anything to me in response. A category can't hurt me. But as Jasper pointed out with regards to the law of value, these categories like profit, wage, labor, money, totally different. If I run my firm and I decide, well, profit doesn't do it for me as a concept anymore, or money, I'm tired of it, no more commodities. I can go out and I can choose to not accept payment for the commodities I sell, and I can choose to pay folks whatever I like. But in the long run, I'm not really able to do this. And as an individual, I do have to sell my labor power in order to eat. These categories are able to push back on us. And I try to formalize this a little better in a book I'm working on as categories of shaping forces. But for the moment, I'll just talk about it without the formalism. So I'll circle back to this point a little later on. But I will agree, first of all, that value is a demon in the matrix, phenomenal phrase. And under non-capitalism, which we agree is non-communism, it's not necessarily regulative. But there's also an interesting side to value I'm going to emphasize. It does something for us. It's evaluative. It's very good at this evaluation too. It helps us make production trade-offs. It helps us, for the liberal, it puts us, given we're able to deal with externalities, et cetera, in as good a world as we could have. When we express a complaint about social domination by value, we are expressing a point of disjunction between our standards for evaluation, how we make evaluative judgments about these trade-offs, how to organize society, et cetera, which do not square with the evaluation that value is doing. This is what we're talking about when we say the domination of value over society is bad. It's not good. Why is it bad? Why is it not good? I'm going to ask a little kid's question. The answer is we have some concept of the good. We have it evaluating these possibilities, these choices, and we're currently getting the wrong one. The real trade-offs we're getting with domination for value, the ones which we systematically and necessarily get, are failing to meet a standard against which you believe we should be evaluating trade-offs. So why are we correcting it? What's wrong with its evaluation? What's wrong with evaluation in general? So I'm going to continue, go back to a little bit of the stuff we were talking about, shaping forces and the big so what of the test of value. Insofar as we have knowledge that given people either are a certain way or they want a certain set of things, on aggregate, they can't get it. So we know that our test, for me, it is in a sense also tendential. It points to the emergence of people dominating concepts from a particular set of assumptions about people, markets, the objectification of social relations. And this is highly persuasive, but the object isn't just showing whether this is communism or non-communism. Whether we're in communism or non-communism, well, I would say we probably have a lot of tells for that. We have so many mutually necessary moments of capital that we have a lot of signs. Any one of them will probably do our purpose. So the critique I think we're pulling out is something that capitalism can't fix, that's wrong no matter how you think about right or wrong, whether you prize autonomy, human flourishing, desire satisfaction, or what have you. So this grounding, this remediation of the concrete complaint within an arbitrary axiological system is where we recover our positive concept of communism from. The one which is missing. It's rooted in a particular concept of the good. And to recover a concept of communism, I think it's worthwhile to look to the grounding of this concept in the good. Now, we also have some sense of the positive answer for the missing moment somewhere else in the piece. We get it as well from Bordiga, maybe from Dauvé, from Marx, with a test of communism, which is, we're told, a positive test. And we see in the piece, to quote it, the power of Bordiga's critique is not as it imagines that it locates value in these post-capitalist scenarios, but that it formulates what must be done to produce communism once value has been abolished. So there's an interesting question. How the communism we are able to recover from our concept of the good, the concept with which we ground the critical element of our test of value, wherever it comes from, holds up against what we grab from this positive test. So we've maybe drilled down a little bit from the fetish that's just like, well, abolish value because it's value. And we're getting into concerns about the difference between the evaluative judgments value imposes upon social life and the evaluative judgments we find ourselves making. So in the final section of this piece, I'm going to ask that you hold in your mind the question, how are we evaluating? And why are the results of evaluation different than the evaluations made by value? So I'm going to look at a couple, so we agree, Jasper and I, that distribution and production are dissimilar, that labor certificates are not a good idea, probably in most circumstances, there's not a good rationale for them really. And that when we say things about distribution, particularly distribution without value, we're not saying things about decisions as to production. So to try to drill a little more into the evaluation that happens in these discussions of production, I'm going to briefly consider some passages where we see this discussed at some length. It's passage 1. Imagine, for example, a state of affairs in which freely associated laborers work voluntarily in a number of different workshops according to a common plan. Another is, and this one is from Pannekoek, in a society where the goods are produced directly for consumption, there's no market to exchange them and no value. And then we go down a little bit, we see a plain and intelligible numerical image. The process of production is laid open to everybody's views. Mankind views and controls its social life. The workers and their councils devise and plan in organized collaboration. And one last one, which comes not from the test of communism, but from an earlier piece on planning and anarchy. While measurement of labor time reduces every activity to a single value and single form of optimization, that of minimal labor time, there are in fact many other values that people will seek to increase or decrease. Ecological, salutary, aesthetic. Decisions cannot be made in terms of a single synthetic measure, but instead must reckon with a plurality of units and a host of objectives. The good in this view is a vector, not a scalar. And Jasper mentions in this piece, this comes from personal correspondence with Bjorn Westergaard, who's also influential in some great work by Aaron Vandenhoff, one of the EndNotes guys on planning. So we agree on a lot of stuff. So we're not going to be looking for the absence of value in these proposals. We're going to be looking at evaluation and how evaluation is grounded. We agree, end of the piece, tasks of communism, break the link between right and responsibility, labor contribution and receipt of social wealth, communized consumption, distribution, and production, according to common freely devised plan. So I'm going to try to pluck out of this a couple things which for me indicate some gesture as to how we're doing evaluation. We have activity is freely chosen, which is reminiscent of free association. We have common plan, we have transparency. And the talk earlier, Jasper mentioned the goal is all around development of the individual, which for me is very reminiscent of a talk that our friend Michael Heinrich gave about communism as the full development of the free individual. We also have in the evaluation column, we have many values. Good is a vector, not a scalar. From the Westergaard conversation, this for me reminds me strongly of O'Neill's argument in The Market from talking about Aristotle and the incommensurability of goods. So the question is here, what values? What do we do when they conflict? How are we evaluating? And this question is relevant because we have issues with the way in which value is evaluating. So we have, for instance, scenarios where not just values conflict, not just in terms of consumption goods. These are very interesting. We have, for instance, ones where folks who live on islands in the Pacific, which are at risk of becoming underwater, face the destruction of their homes and the destruction of the natural environment as intrinsically at odds with consumption of things like aviation. This is a hard trade-off to make. I'm not going to tell you that I have the right or wrong answer, but I'm interested in figuring out what we would propose to do in issues where we have large trade-offs like these between values, not just between consumption goods. So I'm going to try to embed this evaluation into three normative directions. One says that Marx is concerned with autonomy for its own sake, having actions prescribed whatsoever. I think this collapses into a kind of contractualism. We have another means of normatively embedding the so what in the idea that Marx is concerned with the failure of the realization of species being. I don't view this with derision. I'm not interested in arguing some huge epochal break in Marx. And it's a defensible view that eudaimonia is not a good among others. It's not a subjective state. It is approaching the telos of people. It's for people what it means to work well. We have some kind of natural, historical, objective species judgment about what it is to be human. This for me is where you go with the many values thing, good is the vector stuff that Westergaard, Mill, Aristotle, among some other guys I'll talk about. The third one is the wacky one. It's communist welfarism. I'm going to try to briefly gesture why I think this is a defensible view that we should be interested in. So as for the first, this kind of, we should be interested in autonomy for its own sake. You can say that we won't mediate in X and Y ways. People can choose what rules bind them. They can freely leave any association. There are probably some issues with this. Democratic conscious planning does not meet that standard. That decisions are democratic and conscious between workers or communities or what have you does not mean necessarily that we can square this with people being able to choose what set of rules or societal decisions bind them. And this is the point that I think Bordiga makes, although I'm not really going to talk about that at length. By this contractualist standard, we would think that the situation with regards to domination was not really remediated in communism. If domination, we would have to have some reason to believe that domination with regard that stems from democratic procedures or that stems from the collective will is distinct from domination as a whole. That there is a particular evaluative, normative reason to believe that it is of a totally different kind. But I don't think this view holds. Our concern in this normative grounding is autonomy, not where domination comes from. So the second view, the Aristotelian one, I think is markedly more persuasive insofar as I think there's a strong grounding for it in terms of what Marx thought. I think it is where the good as a vector, not a scalar thing in Westergaard through O'Neill, through Aristotle's coming from. In many ways, I think it's compatible with what I want to argue for. I'm just going to note a brief issue. The issue is it requires us, in a sense, to be moral naturalists. It requires us to believe that we can make species judgments about what it is to be human, about what humans are, what humans necessarily do, what good functioning for humans is. It also reflects a real skepticism, persistent skepticism about preference aggregation, which I think is in many sense in a lot of ways grounded. The issue with preference aggregation, of course, isn't just math. It's in what sense the aggregation of preferences leads us to communism. So again, holding the question of evaluation in our minds, I think we should ask ourselves how we evaluate without this aggregation with regards to what we talk about, think of as the sphere of necessity. I think the answer implicitly comes through in phrases like common chosen plan and concepts of deliberative free association, which gesture to me at democracy. So this, for me, is, in a sense, the actually existing preference aggregation. It's the aggregation of people's preferences insofar as they can coarsely indicate them through either lobbying groups, pressing buttons to vote, making their voices heard in consensus. It has strengths, it has weaknesses at achieving our goals. We have very limited information. We have particular skews in our sets of knowledge, and we have wildly different intensities to how strongly we believe what we believe factoring in. Why should we believe democracy is this deliberation is working by the evaluative standard we set, whichever one of those three you chose just a minute ago, at helping us adjudicate between these goods with regards to autonomy, welfare, or human flourishing? I think it begs the question. There's a very cute example of direct democratic reasoning and practice, which comes up in a piece of bourgeois political science literature. Illinois decided to put all funding proposals for public funding to direct referendum a couple of decades ago. And so one example was they had to put fire department funding on a direct ballot. And the result of this decision to make it direct democratic was that communities in Illinois overwhelmingly opted, with people had some information, they were asked a question about how much they wanted to devote to some social services, whether they wanted to support fire department capital renewal. And the answer for the most part was, we don't want to pay additional taxes for the fire department. This isn't really a communist question, but it's an example of how folks make trade-offs. And the result of this was communities in Illinois overwhelmingly voted not to fund fire departments, and fire department response times grew by about 300% compared to neighboring counties. It's a really funny, cute example. The question is why we think democracy, why we think deliberation, collective deliberation, free deliberation, conscious deliberation necessarily makes things better with regards to our earlier evaluative question. We need a concept of the good, which to me essentially begs the question. A concept of the good that says something like, whatever is good is the result of democracy. This concept of the good to me is in large part an inheritance of liberalism. The concept that rights bearers, in the sense that Pashukanis shows as downstream of commodity production, under some set of constraints, deliberating, voting, arguing, what have you, generate a result which is good for its own sake. So we can agree that we don't need systematicity, we don't need systematic planning, waste, what have you is fine, but this doesn't absolve the question of how systematically we make or justify trade-offs or evaluation. We still evaluate, whether we pawn it off onto individual people, deliberating, doing what have you. We very often don't have consensus. And the agents still do this, whether they do it by an arbitrary standard we like, or whether they do it by an arbitrary standard we don't. And as it happens, when we lack this systematic evaluative standard, when it comes to production decisions with regard to the realm of necessity, we often wind up making them with regard to material trade-offs when we lack information for human flourishing. So for me, this is a natural outgrowth of what we would expect to practically see from this kind of Neurothian planning in kind. Neurothian planning in kind as a means of dealing with planning for small and local problems with regards to the realm of necessity. When all we have is information about the things we can produce without producing more or less of other things, what we usually wind up producing is something along the lines of production with regards to expansion of the social surplus. And there are a number of ways of formally embedding this. Whether we say on top that this production with regard to, this isn't to say that necessarily we see a collapse in these schemes back into capitalism or what have you, but it does raise a question to me as to whether our production without some systematic evaluative standard with regard to the realm of necessity, with regard to the production of things without producing less things, and having on top of it superimposed deliberative decisions, as Aaron Benyanov might say, protocols, the decisions of councils, what have you. For me, this sounds sort of like production with regard to social surplus. And then on top of it, superimposed some aggregate social evaluative judgments. This for me is kind of reminiscent of what social democracy in practice is. So we're still binding people as well. We're not meeting the obligation, the objection from contractualism. Regardless of whether we say you can't discipline labor, there are no material incentives. Practically speaking, these collective plans still do bind people. They make decisions with regard to production that relate to need satisfaction, even if it's aggregate need satisfaction, even if we don't discipline labor in the same way. We're still engaged in this kind of evaluation. What I think we want, and I don't really have time to talk about this at length at all, is the state of the good in people, which I propose is intrinsic and psychological. I believe is compatible with eudaimonia insofar as a particular historicized kind of eudaimonia reminiscent of McIntyre should square with psychological states, that human flourishing should imply a corresponding psychological state that people are able to avert. And I also believe this is less paternalistic and does not imply the kind of moral naturalism that either our idea that democracy produces good decisions intrinsically by some property of democracy, or alternatively, the idea that we're able to infer from human species concepts, some concept of the good, the moral naturalism, paternalism that this would imply. I'm not very good at natural historical judgments like these. I don't know how to make species judgments about people, really. So I would argue instead we should look at making inferential evaluative judgments about trade-offs through aggregating subjective well-being to the best way, to the greatest extent we can. And designing procedures collectively around the goal of bringing about this state of the good. Flourishing, which is kind of / subjective well-being. And I think that this is essentially isomorphic on realization of the pre- and non-Marxian concept of production for need. That this kind of production for states of well-being is the practical implication of need satisfaction. So this, for me, leads us to a communist welfarism, which I would argue is probably the evaluative way out of the question we've posed that is tractable, not morally naturalist, and encapsulates our objections to value and what value specifically does. And I'm writing a book right now, which I hope explains how to do that systematically and makes a slightly clearer, more formal case for why this might work and why we should be interested in it. So I don't have any further time, but I just wanted to say thank you to Jasper and the Red May folks, and looking forward to talking more about this soon, continuing the discussion.
Thank you, Cordelia. Kylish, are you somewhere? Give a hail.
You can't see me?
I can see you. Okay, good.
Okay.
How do you talk?
All right.
It
Thank
is
you.
your turn. Step up to the podium, please. Such as
All right. Thanks, everyone. Jasper, Cordelia, Red May, the YouTube chat, everyone. So originally I was going to talk about Pashikanis, but on Friday night, I emailed Jasper and Cordelia that I want to talk about things I can't talk about professionally. So this is just going to be kind of problems in communism. Specifically, I'm interested in the issue of establishing a solidarity between strangers, and what would be the rationality of decision-making. I do think that it's hard to answer until a real movement gets underway, but I do think that we don't confront them because there is a millenarian streak in the left. The end of capitalism would usher utopia, no matter, I include myself in that. So communism will be the first form of society to establish a solidarity between strangers, which does not make recourse to alienated means, exchange, sovereignty, and/or regularized combat, feuds and warfare organized communities. We've also never seen a classless existence that was not held together by kinship, ethnicity, and especially religion. Socialism itself has religious origins. Even worse, each of those classless societies tended to exist in a relation of enmity, both with nature and other societies. Primitive societies knew no class hierarchies within their communities. They did maintain a state of war between each other. Human beings drove Neanderthals out of existence because of our cooperability, not in spite of it. The supposedly socialist kibbutz was a settler utopia. It was sustained by its hatred. We tend to think of how we should socially organize in terms of what's our mode of production. But what are our political, social relations? Fragmentation has always necessitated some kind of exchange practice. Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote, "War was a failed exchange." At the same time, every centralization has reconstituted a state. Every time to overcome that state of nature has brought it to even higher grounds. And we tend to give very easy answers to that problem. We'll do it democratically. If we plan, then conscious control means people will come together. Those are all technical answers. Of course, we need to know how best to organize ourselves. But that answer, how best to organize ourselves, does not answer what is our community. I find that we oftentimes agree with the same phrases, like, "Hey chat, press F if you agree with democracy, conscious control, free individuality. Then press the first letter of your tendency." We all agree, but what does that, we have to work through what that means. But I want to, I think, and this will follow Cordelia, outline a certain naivete that comes from the freedom equals democratic conscious control. This is an idea that comes from the late Marx, who had a rationalist conception of what freedom meant, a society that was wholly transparent, one where we would understand all aspects of our social reproduction so that we can then materially produce, or we can control our material production. It would become production by freely associated men and stands under their conscious and planned control, as he writes in Capital. However, that model of decision-making does not turn out to be true in some ways. Decision-making is instead a product of conscious and unconscious behaviors at the level of individuals, and autonomy and heteronomy within those societies. Social forms are ways of organizing the relations between conscious and unconscious, autonomy and heteronomy. The left usually focus on the unconscious and autonomy part, while being obsessively afraid of admitting any kind of heteronomy. And I think the autonomists choosing those aspects we talk about, the democratically deliberated ones, are in some ways the easiest ones, precisely because a revolution will kind of lead to a freeing of ourselves. It's what heteronomies we choose that seems to be very difficult. And just as an end, because I'm going to go pretty fast, I'll borrow a claim from Jacques Camat that the human animal is both an individual and a Gemeinwesen. I understand that not like he does in a sort of hippie way, but as ways of understanding the issues of rationality, cooperation, autonomy, heteronomy in our existence. So at an individual level, human beings relate to each other on the basis of reciprocal altruism. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. We establish cooperation, punished affection to increase or reproduce society. Sharing is as much a form of altruism as the exchange of equivalents. It's just one is better than the other. This is an instrumental view of how people interact. But are we all that is? This is what bourgeois decision-making would say, that we're homo economicus or rational choice game theory, is community. That might be a reasonable assumption for chimpanzees and gorillas. They create alliances and communities. They practice reciprocal altruism. They do a lot of the things we do, but they're also really bad at it. They defect the minute they see a new shiny object or banana. There is something to us that can cooperate at a level beyond the instrumental reasons that neoclassical economics tells us we will only do. The only people who have been found to act that way are people who suffer severe brain trauma from car accidents. They're non-functional, they need hospice care, because it simply takes too long to calculate in that way that the orthodox model says. They stand in front of their closet for hours, calculating the marginal utility of what shirt to wear. Emotions, instincts, all those things that we consider irrational and conscious are in fact the very basis by which conscious decision-making can take place. There is this non-transparent core that is the basis for rational action. So how is it that we can calibrate this unconscious and conscious, develop social forms that would not just be another form of, socially engineering people's desire, really? And so it is that we, on that basis, create a level of cooperation that no other mammal can, both for better and for worse. For better, because it creates possibility for communism, and for worse, because we kind of are destroying nature because of it. And this is where you kind of move into that collective level, where human beings communicate in a way that is a community, one that is organic and integral. Habits, customs, shared goals, a telos, a goal brings together in a way that simple instrumentality does not. But human community is usually in this kind of ultra-left literature, always understood as this utopia, this one where we all agree, or one that is where autonomy and heteronomy are overcome. The thing is, they have a moment of truth. It's a degree of heteronomy where we don't democratically decide. We do not democratically decide on our community. It is the conditions of possibilities of such a decision. We need that minimal agreement that brings us together in order to act in the way Marx wants us to. Value is a Gemeinwesen. Starting with the relative form, he puts a dyadic relation between individuals. Then there is an expanded form, which is the sum total of these relations. So far, he is just with the bourgeoisie. But the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Those actions create a social structure that exercises downward pressure through constraints, imperatives, in structuring the incentives towards which we respond. That is the abstract domination that is nonetheless a product of our own hands. The value, that Gemeinwesen of value, has no vital link. It is a community held together only by formal abstractions. The money form and its complement, the legal form, the latter of which comes together to create a repressive state apparatus, the state form. All that holds us together are just these abstractions with no content. And they're not value, but they are an abstract domination, in which, the type of relations that Jasper, Gilles, Dauvé, a lot of communisms have with the late Marx on that conscious control, on the idea that the development of the productive forces transforms almost immediately into all-sided development, tying things to labor, to right, is that there is that formalism in Marx, and this is also why we tend to skew towards the early Marx, that he didn't have. There was that more substantive concept, true human nature is the human community. And so we overcome the test of value, but we might just recreate domination in a different way. if all we think of is organizationally, in terms of planning, in terms of how best to calibrate ourselves. Now, of course, all not heteronomy is abstraction, but one in which we link together people in just a managerial way will throw us around without our control. There are kind of two solutions we find on the left. One wants to maximize autonomy and a Rousseauian rustic existence. And then one, which is in the kind of left of Lenin milieu, everyone who would be denounced in 1920. And then there's another one that really thinks in terms of scaling up, overwhelming administered existence. Zizek recently defended war communism, People's Republic of Walmart, Gosplan 2.0, Twitter's strange fascination with Stalinism. It's interesting to think through our solutions in this separation, autonomy, heteronomy. Can we even imagine something beyond that as long as we are in capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you, Kailash. So all of the guests in the room here, does anybody have a question that they would like to ask any of our three speakers?
There's one question in the chat.
All right, let's see where I'm trying to find it in the chat.
Is it the Goldhawk one?
Yeah.
I can talk about
what's the relationship between value and land / private property / settler colonialism under capitalism?
I can talk about the value settler colonialism one, if you guys want. Yeah.
All right, you want to try to take that one?
Yeah. Okay. So value is an abstract relation. Settler colonialism is a concrete act. So there's no one-to-one translation, but there are certain aspects that value theory does help with. So settler colonialism establishes value relations in in the frontiers in capitalist land. So it's a form of primitive accumulation. But there's also a certain genocidal logic to capitalist settler colonialism that was not there in previous forms. I mean, like settling other people did not exist. And that is intrinsic to the way value relates to labor. So concrete and abstract labor create a separation between natural and social. It makes labor kind of this nature-imposed natural necessity. And so indigenous people were not just outside of that relationship, but then on that basis considered not human, right? They were flora and the fauna, hence the idea that they need to be wiped out rather than just dominated or integrated as subaltern. That's what I can say about value.
All right, Jasper, you want to comment on that, or?
Well, that was a fantastic answer. I think better than I could have given. But I would just, one thing I would just say about land in particular is that, I think for Marx, it's fair to say that for him, commodified land is like the most fetishistic commodity, and it's the most mystified. And that's why he sort of ends there, after in the 3 volumes, that it comes back to ground rent, because property and land is the most ridiculous of concepts, right? Really, just pure fiction. And when it comes to land, I mean, I really like the way that Bordiga treats these questions of land, right? He's quite like sophisticated thinker on this, and he points out that with land, really, the concept of property is just always false, because there's really only usufruct when it comes to land, because no matter you own it, but you will only be using it for a period of time. And in fact, no one can really own the land, because the land is, beyond us. And I think that, if there's, I think a lot that that, value theory can say about the, absurdity of, land ownership and all that that, produces, and the kinds of, manias.
Okay, I have a question, and I apologize to everybody about how incoherently I will formulate this. I just found out I would be moderating this afternoon, so I hadn't read or haven't read Jasper's very dense and fascinating talk. So I'm going to ask the short version of the question, which of course you've answered to a certain degree when you've gone over the notion of labor money and labor chits and back over the stuff at the beginning of Grundrisse. But my question, as I would pose it, is, can there be something called communist money? Now let me cut back on that, because as I say, you might already answer. I've tried to think about different ways that people have to allocate work that call themselves communist societies to, that at a certain point, for example, I know that Mao had like 33 different levels of what people were in the Soviet Union. And then there's in the People's Republic of China, the people got salaries at that level. And then, there are other moments in the Soviet Union where they seem to be working on fumes with the idea of the Stakhanovite, or one just goes and volunteers and keeps going stuff, which doesn't seem that it's sustainable for a long period of time and doesn't end the kind of factory work and treadmill work that capitalism has made so repulsive to people that they want to get rid of it. We know what money does in capitalism, that it, as a unit of account or a token of exchange, one can sort of imagine something like money, but the moment it becomes a store of value, it introduces replicates all the distortions that we've seen capital introduce into people's lives. So we're trying to establish value anyway. So I'm wondering if there is a Kantian antinomy that I would pose this way. You cannot have money, but you can't not have something like it. Now, to a certain extent, your talk is a bold attempt to answer that. I particularly like the way you frame the oppositions not as disjunctive, either or, but as, they can both exist, but other things can exist and so forth. So, and what I apologize for is not being able to synthesize all that together in my mind to kind of add up your answer, which I might have been able to do better. I read through it about 3 or 4 times, but I'll bring that up again, and I'd love to hear everybody on this particular question. I guess I'm talking, you've already answered and said the allocation will be done by planning in advance. It's there's nothing like a market that sort of tells us how much of this or that someone needs. We're making planning in advance, and then people just go collect things, or they do whatever work they're doing, and the amount of work they do is not related to what they get, and so forth, from each according to ability to each according to his needs. But so I throw out that incoherent mess of a question to everybody. Under the heading, can there be communist money, or are we dealing with some kind of antinomy? That's
Someone want to answer first before me?
Oh, sure. No. Money, I think, inevitably, in tying it to labor, in tying it to, I think, a formal mediation in that way, will inevitably reconstitute competition. The only way you can get the price of money, something disciplined within money, is through competition, eventually market. Like money isn't just this arbitrary thing to make facilitation. It's a way of imposing and constraining our decision making.
Yeah, I agree with that. It also really depends on what you mean by money. You know, money has multiple functions. It's means of payment, it's medium of exchange, a store of value. And certainly the labor certificate that, you know, Marx talks about, he says it's not money. It preserves, you know, it preserves a very limited function. And so, I mean, I don't want to get into a semantic argument about whether that's money. My opinion on that is I avoid a strict yes or no answer. You know, I say it's not necessarily incompatible in a certain construction, but I don't think it's really necessary. What I do think is, you know, possibly not incompatible is a sort of, you know, direct rationing, and even, you know, even if it were some, you know, general allotment of, you know, credits in some way, I'm not sure about those things necessarily being wrong or right, but that would not be money. It wouldn't circulate. It wouldn't be storable, and certainly it wouldn't, you know. At the same time, all of that said, I think that the point about communism is that it's really about what's happening, how's the basis of society organized, and if money or markets, like, you know, black markets and things like that, and money exists at the edges, it just doesn't matter, right? The point is that you organize things in such a way that, you know, so, you know, if there's some, you know, sort of pseudo money in operation, that doesn't necessarily sink it. But the point is that the majority of people's reproduction is not mediated through that. And what I'm trying to say is that it makes sense to communize, to make common most consumption, for a lot of reasons, but chiefly because you don't necessarily then have to have kind of these individual transactions. And I mean, this gets to you know, Cordelia's objections, and I don't want to sort of speaking to that, but yeah, I think that, you know, I won't say yes or no, but mostly yes, we got to get rid of it.
Yeah, I mean, I liked your answer, Jasper, because I'm first inclined to answer like Kailash at the beginning and just say, no, we're getting rid of value. But it's very interesting to see what heterodox economists are trying to do, make some proposals to try to do to money, to change it to something else that isn't money, as you would put it. In other words, what they're trying to do is to take the value function away from money and make it, you know, by devices that they call rotting money or 1 month money, where they're trying to make it impossible to store and to make every transaction finish immediately so no one can accumulate. So that just interests me as an investigation into what money is, you know, from that standpoint of why that's not going to work either, even though it tries to address the problem that you know, classical economics ignores by just saying money is a neutral veil and everything is like barter anyway. You know, someone is changing this or that for it. So I wonder, Cordelia, if you had some thoughts on that particular question about.
Yeah. So first note, I don't understand money at all. I really like I think there's a lot of work that still remains to be done on the Marxist epistemology of money. But for me, the question sort of hinges on whether we see money, again, as an abstraction, what in terms of the historically specific role it plays under capitalism as the universal commodity, which, like Marx says, walks like the universal figure of the animal among the rest of commodities, or which is a particular social role that sets of things may have. So for me, the question hinges on whether we locate money with regards to the role of universal exchangeability and fungibility, or instead whether we locate money with regards to its connection to coinage and the state. And I think there are compelling arguments we can make in both directions for a concept of money as hinging uniquely on state rights that predates generalized commodity production, versus whether we see money in terms of the historically specific role it plays under capitalism. As for the latter case, I think it's obvious that there can't be something that meets this description, which serves as a universal commodity. But a counter argument that somebody in the first camp might have to me would be something like, there are varying gradations of degrees to which things are money-like, which relate to the ability of people to exchange them for other things in general. So for me, it's an interesting question whether something like Bitcoin is money, or whether something like, the classic example is cigarettes in prisons, right? Or like World War II cigarettes in POW camps are money. So there are different states of the degree to which something is money-like with regards to universal exchangeability, which come on a gradation. And so somebody who says it isn't about truly universal exchangeability, it's somewhat of a spectrum and it hinges upon, or versus somebody who says it hinges upon some specific conception of how we deal with the state and coinage, is for me kind of an open question. So I don't really know how to, obviously like money, simpliciter can't exist under communism, but I think there's also like an interesting open question that would rely on a conceptual clarification of what we mean when we talk about money that I don't really know how to offer in like a clear or satisfactory stance. In general, though, I would say I agree with Jasper at the programmatic level and say that regardless of our specific ontological understanding of money, there are very good reasons to believe that consumption goods should be provisioned freely. And in fact, there's a relatively long tradition of non-value abolitionist social democratic economists, folks like Oscar Lange, who advocate this as well. Like the provision of satiation goods and public goods for free is something that Lange actually proposes when he's talking about his programmatic sketch of value simulation through tâtonnement. So it's kind of a thorny question with a couple sides to it. I don't know if that answer helps. I think it really like evokes further questions more than it offers a simple answer, but I hope that that was at least a little interesting.
Good questions here. I think that the general theory now on the cigarettes in prison camps in World War II is that sort of barter is constituted only after there is a monetary system kind of lurking in the background that's already there. It's not the system itself. At least that's what David Graeber claims or claimed. We were talking about this the other night with, I don't know if people know Martin Konings and Lisa Atkins, who've written about, she has a book called The Time of Money, and Martin has a book called Capital and Time and so forth. And we're going over some of the definitions of money, or some of the I don't know, descriptions of what money does. And Marx, of course, says it's your passport to society. It's essentially gets you, you need this to get in to do anything, or to life that you can't do it. Borges had a line about how money is a repertory of possible futures. So it's that quality of having the savings and the stuff that will enable you to do things in the future, not just in the present. The thing that they talk about, they're trying to answer a particular phenomenon, which is that things that weren't money somehow become money after a certain point of time. First, they acquire some notion of moneyness, whether they were kind of bills of exchange, they become negotiable, and after a while, you know, it becomes paper money. When there have even been proposals, I mean, whether Bitcoin or those things are in the position of whether they have moneyness, but will become at some point money. So they try to anticipate that by definition of money sets things in motion, so that anything that sets things in motion can come. But it's interesting just from the standpoint of how conceptually diffuse the notion of money is at the moment, however authoritative someone intends to be when they give it. So that's a long-winded way of saying I like Jasper's answer and your answer in terms of, and what I get from you also from your talk is there's a certain pragmatic feeling out of getting to the right level of what you'll be when you're doing things. You're not applying a system that's derived from a theory which logically divides the world into half, and then this you can't have, and so forth. Which I guess what you're trying to get to a point is if something doesn't work, you can junk it and try some other version until it all kind of falls out right. But how awful that we should end up with pragmatism when we started with all of these other places, if it's at least the communist pragmatism. Does anyone rescue me here with, I know we have a lot of people whose stuff I read on the Value Forum board who are asking wonderful questions all the time. Step up, someone. Alex Locasio, do you have something, a question? The New Institute for Social Research, I bet you guys have a question.
I think there's a question. I mean, there's a question for me from Joshua, my boyfriend.
Okay.
But I can answer it. Maybe I'll answer it because this might be a way to get at something that Cordelia was saying. And just say that, I mean, one of the problems with this particular approach is that I decided to focus only on a certain part of Marx's theory and to leave to the side, I think, the majority of the theory in some way. And what I think Marx thought was, in some sense, the most important part of it, which is his tendential theory, his theory of the development of capitalism, and its directionality, which is, of course, essential to any sort of communist strategic analysis. We need not only a concept of the target, the object, but we need to know where we are and how we could plausibly get there. So I haven't said anything about any of that. And the reason why is I think that this is where Marx is just more wrong. And how could he not be, in terms of the mere fact that communism didn't happen indicates that there's something up. And his tendential theory is also incredibly complicated. And it's a point of, it's about which there is a lot of debate. Whereas I felt actually the value theory, there's been a kind of coming together of a certain Marxological consensus. And I'm proposing a new way to think about the purpose of that. What is it? Why do we care about value? But the answer to that is not the most important thing, I think, ultimately. And so the next part of the project is where I'm going to get to that tendential theory. And there's a connection, right? The law of value is always tendential, right? It can only enforce that regulation of society by producing accumulation, by producing a kind of forward-moving dynamic. And that doesn't mean it's going somewhere in a particular place, but it does have a kind of shape and a characteristic. And that's, I think the most important Marxist theory is tendential theory of that sort, but it's usually kind of a departure from Marx. Because when you're talking about tendencies, you're always trying to note, look at something new in the world. So I guess that's how I see myself. So I see myself very much aligned with this kind of school that sees crisis theory as very important to Marx. It's just that, what is Marx's crisis theory? I don't think there's ever going to be any agreement on that. I think that he has 17 different theories. And ultimately, what Marx thought is not that interesting at that moment. If we're going to do crisis theory, we should be like looking at the world. And I think that the best tendential writers of our time, Joshua among them, mostly proceed in that way. So, yeah, that's just the answer.
So you would agree with Heinrich that Marx is an unfinished project, and that essentially we are completing it, not only in figuring out how to instantiate it into the world, but also how to. Of course.
I mean, and Marx himself, I mean, you have to recognize his modesty, right? I mean, he I mean, for me, the reason why I can argue logically is because I think that for Marx, communism already existed in the world as a thing that he could take as a given, and that's because the workers' movement had brought it into the world. He doesn't announce communism. He's saying that it's already emerged in 1848. So he always takes his direction from class struggle. So if 200 years later, we're still trying to look for direction from Marx, we haven't really read Marx very closely, because the point is to pay attention to the class struggle. So I don't know, yeah.
That seems like a good point to end on. Are there any
Cordelia wants to jump in. Cordelia wants to jump in.
Yeah, anybody want to jump in here?
I was just going to briefly riff on that and say that I think Jasper's point about tendential analysis as not necessarily rooted in Marx, but in terms of our ability to look at the real world, generalize, et cetera, generate predictions from that, et cetera, super on point, something I would, in general, strenuously agree with. And I want to emphasize that I think skepticism that you see sometimes around Marx's specific argument for the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, or nitpicking around that, kind of misses the broader point, which is that there's tons of interesting discussion to be had about many, many tendential theories. And for me, the really thorny, interesting bit is asking ourselves what politically we can do with these tendential theories and the specific political horizons, the political use that tendential theories generate. Because for me, when I frame any of the, when I frame Marx in the light I did, is really coming out of a specific lens of wanting to relate what he does to something communists can do to bring about communism. It's like, first and foremost, a political question, particularly insofar as it's instrumental. Yeah. And I think there are a bunch of other questions from YouTube, in the chat, et cetera.
Yeah, I see a few here. There's one about what do you think of the factor of scale in communism? Is scale more of a quantitative multiplication of issues discussed here, or a qualitatively distinct problem in its own right that's directed at everybody?
What does factor of scale, does that mean mass production scale? Or?
Yeah, I'm also not really clear the factor of scale in communism. I'm not totally sure what that means.
Well, when they use it in political theory now, they talk about the difference between a city-state like Athens and a huge multicultural empire or something. So the notion that being that some particular political regime would work for a city, but wouldn't work for a large continental empire. So it might be something along that scale, though of course it would have to be something more than in one country to actually be communism. So does anybody want to, is that off of YouTube? Oh, okay. Well, yeah. We don't know, we'd have to guess.
I think when I talk about communism, I like to talk in broad systematic strokes, not because I like, system stamping the common person into the ground, but because I think we often assume away a lot of questions by talking about them only with regards to small groups where there's consensus. Maybe that's a contentious point. For me, there's a real injustice with regards to endowments, et cetera, in people being born into different places with different, or into people being born into places with different distributions of resources, institutions which reflect different abilities to live a free and developed life. And so for me, when I think about communism, I usually I think like a good implicit framing, and this relates to a question about withering away of the state on YouTube. I often come back a lot, even though it's Marxologically unfashionable, to Marx's critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, talking about these things in terms of universality and a broadly cosmopolitan communism. I'll let other people jump in.
I can, Jasper, or Jasper, do you want? Okay. So I can answer some things. Factor of scale, if that means like political unit, we would have to overcome political fragmentation. Like exchange value first originates between organized communities. That as long as you maintain those separated entities with that sovereign, you're gonna eventually need some kind of alienated means. Because yes, we can do it all nice with like talking cooperation when conflicts really aren't that important. But when you really want to fight, then you'll fight. And we need somewhere to do that without, you know, those alienated means. We're going to have communes that grow at various different rates. How do we stop, you know, just like an imperial commune? Yeah, so that's simple. You have to scale that. And then it's two more about withering away the state. I guess we'd have different answers, but it's smash the state machinery thoroughly. All communization is the beginning of, you know, getting rid of it. But and then I'll recommend reading the GIK's like criticism of syndicalism, their particular version, because they deal with this centralization autonomy one the most directly. Then Joshua, complexity generates unpredictable nonlinear effects. So sometimes we get larger versions of the initial problems, sometimes we get new ones, but it's a priori unpredictable, I guess.
Can I just jump in to sort of speak to this point, but maybe address a bunch of things. I really liked Kailash's remarks about the stranger and about the importance of the notion of communist hospitality and universality. I think this is like completely essential, and one of the flaws of the ultra left tradition coming out of council communism is, you know, its potential kind of democratism and even kind of federalism. And I don't think that deliberation solves all problems, and that's actually precisely what I'm not arguing. And what I'm suggesting is that you can't simply just federate everybody without reproducing heteronomy. And I also agree with Kailash that in some way it's about a choice of heteronomy. There's no avoiding certain path-dependent choices. My claim specifically is that the work of revolution, and this will be heteronymous, it will be violent, is about remaking the world and reorganizing production so that interests are more common and so that those conflicts of interest don't appear as as strong. It doesn't mean that you don't need mechanisms for dealing with dispute. But the point is to kind of reorganize life so that you don't have so many decisions that have to be kind of aggregated and you get these kinds of complexities. So, but then that does also bring up, the problem of universality. So at the one time, I think you want to communize consumption so that people are kind of consuming with other people. But you don't want to fix people into these fixed communities. You're going to get kind of tribalism. There has to be some notion of kind of the cosmopolitan, the universal. You have to have some way that essentially people are moving in between different kinds of communities, so that it's not, just, and that's something that I think, where I'm actually quite sympathetic to, I think, a lot of what Cordelia is getting at. I'm not against the notion of, having these kinds of universal principles that allow people to make decisions. In a certain sense, having a metric, a universal welfare metric or whatever, and using that to make a decision, there's nothing wrong with that, right? The question is how it's used. So I think, and I think that these are all things that will emerge as a consequence, like those universal principles. I think Kailash is exactly right. They will be produced by the revolution, that will be the fundamental culture. And yeah, it's not going to be, it's not going to be some process of just kind of aggregating preferences and you get a result that is happy for all. So I think that, yeah, you both want to localize as much as you can and decentralize, but at the same time you need to universalize. And those are you don't want to produce just kind of fragmentation and competition in between communities. So
I'm looking at the chat and I can't see any new questions. No.
Well, there's one more question about the state, which I didn't really address.
We sort of talked about that, but yeah, what's the test of communism regarding the famous withering away of the state?
Well, I think this
By the way, what is the state?
Well, that's a good question. And one of the interesting things about Pachicanis is that he gives you a really great definition of the state and law based on Critique of the Gotha program. This notion of abstract universality, of abstract equality, is, for Pachicanis, the basis of bourgeois law and the state. So, in a way, he's saying as long as you still have that kind of, that abstract universality, especially if it's a compulsion to labor, the state still persists. And for Pachicanis, the state emerges wherever there are conflicts of interest that need to be settled violently. So the point is that, communism is essentially the production of common interests, and it's through the production of common interests that you don't make the state wither away, but you destroy it and you make it no longer, necessary. So I think that that's actually a really good way. I mean, of course, that's not all there is to be said about the state, but it is a useful way of thinking about it, for these particular questions. If you're going to force people to work, you're going to have something like the state, and that's one of the reasons why, you don't want to do that.
So there's another question. How could Esposito, which I assume is Roberta, but it could be Elena, how could Esposito's reconfigurations of community/communitas potentially inform democracy within communism or council communism, which passes these values/communist tests?
I've never read Esposito, so I can't answer it.
I'm also not familiar with Esposito's work.
One of them is a systems theorist a la Nicholas Luhmann, and the other one is a biopolitics person. Am I right?
I know the book. It's a biopolitics book, but I haven't.
Yeah, I've heard of him. It's just
on the pile.
I was in grad school once, so I've already done a lot of talking about books I've never read, so I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, can we defer that question until after the revolution?
Actually, it's a good idea.
Oh, okay, that's been tabled. I think we're done here, as they say in The Sopranos. Jasper, it's your rodeo, yes? Or would you like to make a final statement?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're at 2 hours. I think it was great. Yeah.
I thoroughly enjoyed this. I hope everybody else did. This is the third Red May event today. We will go back to a more rational 2 after a 2-day rest. And we start again on Wednesday. And what do we have? Well, I can't, here we go. I'm not going to do all of them, but we do have some good stuff coming up on debt, on counterinsurgency policing, on Marx, Asia, and history, on settler colonialism, Chinese Cultural Revolution, Feminist International. So do go to www.redmayseattle.org. And also, when you're there, donate. Thank you very much, Jasper, for organizing this. Thank you, Cordelia and Gilles, for responding. And thanks to everyone who sent in questions or entered the Zoom room and made your presence felt. Enjoy the rest of the day and come back to Red May when we're on again.